Greetings, my name is Timothy Collinson and I'm the Faculty Librarian for Technology. And this video is going to have a look at plagiarism and how it relates to referencing, and a follow-up video will actually look at referencing in a little bit more detail. So if I share my slides with you, you should be able to see there a quote from Sir Isaac Newton saying, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." And of course, he was considering the fact that he wasn't working in a vacuum. The work that he'd done was building on previous generations and previous science. And of course, we're doing exactly the same thing. And our work is in the context of higher education and that bigger picture of knowledge of our subject area. So let's just have a little think about what referencing does for us very quickly. Firstly, it's recognizing the work of others that we've used in the preparation of our assignments or our dissertations. And secondly, it's identifying the authors and their work, which you've used, so that it can be found once again. So why do we do referencing? Well, it's one of the few occasions it's acceptable in British culture actually to show off, because it establishes the extent and the quality of our research, what we've been reading, what we've been looking at, what we've been finding. It strengthens our academic argument, and it acknowledges the moral right of the authors that we've used, that their work is something they produced and we're understanding that. It allows readers to consult and to verify our data. And of course, we might be those readers subsequently. You might have a string of assignments all on related topics and you think, I referenced something previously that would be worth having a look at again here. And it makes it much easier to find it if you've referenced it accurately. And the final reason, of course, is the pragmatic one, to avoid plagiarism. And that's the purpose of what we're going to have a look at in the following slides. So plagiarism essentially occurs when we do not acknowledge the ideas of others. Perhaps we build on someone's ideas without putting a citation in. We change the wording slightly of the original source, but don't include the details to show what that source was. Perhaps we copy word for word from textbooks or perhaps off the internet without putting in the details again. Or even submitting as our own work someone else's assignment or something we bought off the internet, which of course is plagiarism and goes against any academic integrity. There are, of course, though, reasons why you might plagiarize, and I completely understand these. They can be a temptation to us even in the workplace, so it's best to learn to avoid them now and to develop good habits. The first might be just lack of time. You started too late, course is too pressured, and this is a bit of a shortcut. Maybe you can't do the coursework and you think, this is kind of a placeholder until I can catch up. And of course, maybe you're just not keeping up, might be another possibility. You might think about feel that there's a lack of support for what you're doing. And hopefully, if you've not come across it, do recognise there's support from the library, of course. There's support from the academic skills unit in the Nuffield building. There's support from the wellbeing team and chaplaincy. And support, of course, from your tutors, which I would highly recommend you make time to talk to, get in touch with and say, this is difficult, or I'm struggling with this, or I need help with that. And I'm sure they'll be very happy to give you that kind of support. There might be the fear of a poor mark or not wanting to disappoint. That might be not wanting to disappoint yourself or colleagues or your tutors or perhaps even parents or something like that. So it can be a very strong motivation to try plagiarism as a solution to it, but it doesn't help in the long run. Some people see it, of course, as more efficient and a quicker way of doing things, but it's not very efficient, of course, when you're in trouble for it. So again, best avoided. Laziness can be an option. There are some cultures around the world that don't think it's wrong because it's actually honourable to make sure the masters are being recognised. And in Western higher education, of course, that unfortunately is not the case. So we do have to look out for plagiarism and make sure we're referencing correctly. And then finally, there's the possibility that you think you can get away with it. But as easily as you can find things on the internet, of course, tutors or the Turnitin software can do those same searches as well to find things in reverse. And of course, plagiarism actually can hinder your learning. Now, it doesn't particularly matter if you're just taking a surface approach where you're just trying to get through the assignment and get on with the next thing. Even there, as you can see in the red there, citing textbook knowledge as supporting evidence can help your learning there. But if you're taking that deep approach where your aim is really to understand the subject, you can see a whole slew of red things there, which actually really do support your learning, or in reverse, plagiarism will actually hinder your learning. So I won't go through that in detail, but I'd encourage you that there is good pedagogical reasons for referencing, and some academics will actually give marks for good referencing, so it's worth picking up those marks by being accurate and consistent. Do have a look at your assignment rubrics to make sure you know what's expected of you. So just to note that plagiarism isn't limited, of course, to the academic world. It can equally get you into trouble in whatever walks of life you end up in. So it's why it's important to get it right now, so you don't have to redo an assignment, retake a year, get thrown out of the university. We want to help you to get that right. So these three examples just show you where in other places in the world things have cropped up like this, and you may have come across news items like the one about George Harrison's My Sweet Lord there. The New York Times article is the second thing there about plagiarism, or even noticing, for the civil engineers that there might be copyright, for example, in architects' plans, and that looking at those kind of permissions and copyright is actually an important part of your future work. Just take a look for a minute at these two reference lists, and in a moment I'll ask you to pause the video and just to examine them in a bit more detail, and then we can come back together and I can talk through that. But just have a look at them. Don't worry about the subject content of them. Don't worry about full stops and italics and that kind of thing. Just have a look at the kinds of things that are referenced and see if you can spot differences between the two lists. So pause the video now for a minute or two while you do that, and then start it up again and we'll talk further. Okay, now I understand that looking at reference lists can be a little bit tricky until you get used to them, but I do assure you your lecturers will be able to look at a reference list and spot this kind of thing quite easily. So what I'm hoping that you saw is that on the left-hand side there were perhaps more academic, more scholarly references, and on the right-hand side they tended to be perhaps less academic, more along the lines of web pages or kind of magazine articles, that kind of thing. Now, this isn't to say that the right-hand side is incorrect or is the wrong approach. It's just to get you to consider the balance between the two. And it may be that your dissertation, your assignment actually is perhaps a brand new topic and there's not much published yet in scholarly literature, or it may be that you need for some reason to be referencing newspaper material or that kind of thing. But do check with your tutors that that balance is correct, and just consider what you're actually presenting to your tutors and your markers as the support that you're offering, and just consider whether it's perhaps as academic as they might be expecting. The other thing to look at on that list is on the right hand side, there's a reference there to Wikipedia. Now, there's lots of controversy about this. Some lecturers will say that's okay. Some will say, no, you mustn't reference Wikipedia at all. I'll leave you to talk to your lecturers and tutors about that. I would just say this, that it's worth having a look at Wikipedia articles, perhaps as an introduction to a topic, but then have a look down at the bottom of the articles, and there's often quite a number of really good references to other things which may be quite academic. So it's worth having a look at those and seeing if maybe they would be more appropriate for the particular need that you have. So that's not to say don't reference it, but just check that your tutors are comfortable with that. Some of the practicalities about it. Do read actively. Be thinking as you're reading material about how you might be likely to use a resource. Here's a quote that I could be using. Here's some data that I could be using to back up my research, that kind of thing. And you might want to actually take notes, not just of the quotes and the references, but also how you can use them for future work, which can be helpful. We've also written a couple of library guides, one on academic reading that talks about reading books, and one on academic reading of journal articles. And they're library guides you can find on the webpage. The links are actually in the notes of these slides if you want to check those out. Do head up your notes rather with bibliographic details, keep them clear. If you're quoting, make sure you put the quote marks in, make sure you're copying precisely so that you don't kind of make copy errors. And do note down page numbers. They're so much easier to note at the time when you need them than to find after the fact if you haven't put them in the first place. But you do need to check again with your tutors as to whether they're required. Some need them, some are not so fussed about them. The very general rule is that for books, you probably need to put them in because it's so hard to find material in a book. For journal articles, it may or may not be necessary, but check with your marking rubrics, check with your tutors. And if you are paraphrasing, try to rewrite in your own words to show your real understanding of the concept, but do acknowledge where the idea has come from. Of course, you might also want to consider if you're looking at things on the web and you're printing things out, check that they contain the correct bibliographic detail. Pre-1995, which is getting a bit old for things to reference, but you might need to do that. They often don't give the full journal title or volume and part numbers, so make sure you're making a note of that. If you've got a PDF document, they may not have the URL printed on them, unlike HTML documents. But web page printouts might truncate the URL as well, so just watch out for that and make sure you're getting all the details down. The other little tip that we have is to make a favorites or a bookmark folder in your web browser for your assignments or for your dissertation, and to actually bookmark what you found so you can go back to it later if you need to. And then if you're photocopying, make sure you head up that with the bibliographic information that you need. And if you are reducing pages to save money in the photocopying cost, do check that you're not losing important details. For example, the last page number of an article. So the major question that you should be asking is the item recoverable by the reader? All the details that you're putting into a reference are to help the reader to find that piece of information subsequently. And just to note that some items get cited in the text, but not in the bibliography or the reference list, such as, for example, email messages or interviews. And that's perhaps a good moment to note, of course, that there's two parts to a reference. You'll have your reference list where everything's listed alphabetically by author, usually, and then you'll have your citation in the main text, which refers to everything in the reference list. And it's worth making sure when you're proofreading that every citation has a reference and every reference has a citation. You'll be surprised at the number of people that don't bother to check that, excepting, of course, those things that I've suggested, like statutes, which get citation but not a reference, and personal communications like email messages or interviews. And you may be wondering what the difference between a bibliography and a reference list is. Well, a reference list is, as I've just said, everything you've actually cited in your text. A bibliography, if you want to make the distinction, is everything that you've read. And generally, you won't be asked to produce a bibliography. You'll be asked to produce a reference list. So if your lecturer is making a distinction between those two, that's what's going on there. And if you're struggling to read the text of the little cartoon there, it's a lecturer saying, so the question is, how do you cite a tweet that includes a reference to a Pinterest post inspired by an infographic initially announced via Facebook Live? That's an easy one. Well, rather him than me, but I'll show you a tool at the end, or I'll mention it at least, that may help you with that. And indeed, the further help that we can offer is called Referencing at Portsmouth, and the link to it is there. You can find it on the library homepage. If you do use it, make sure that you're always picking APA 7th edition. All technology students should be using that, except for perhaps mathematicians using LaTeX, but the library doesn't support that. So if you need to do that, you'll have to look up your own help. But for everyone else, APA 7th edition, whatever you're using, that's what you should be using as a referencing style. And you might find increasingly in our databases, in our ebook collections, that there are little cite buttons or cite book buttons, and they can be brilliant, but you will need to choose APA or APA 7th edition when you select that as your style, because they'll cater for several styles. You also need to use them with a little bit of caution, because sometimes they can throw in full first names or capitals where there shouldn't be, or italics where there shouldn't be. So you just need to double check any cite button reference against Referencing at Portsmouth to make sure that it's okay. And if you're just doing half a dozen references, doing them manually is probably as quick as anything you can do. But if you're doing lots of references, perhaps for a dissertation, maybe for a master's degree, certainly at PhD level, then managing your references might become a big enough job in itself to use software such as EndNote Web, which is the one that the university offers, or also Zotero and Mendeley, which you can find on the web. And again, in the notes of the slides, there's links to further help finding out about that. And of course, I didn't put together this presentation in a vacuum. So here's my reference list of all the things I've used. I would only note that this is not in alphabetical order by author, but I've arranged it in a subject fashion, which isn't usually how you'd be expected to do that. So I hope that is helpful for you, and feel free to have a look at those subsequently, including the one in bold at the end is actually the little booklet that I've been using to help write referencing at Portsmouth, and you might find helpful because it covers all of sort of APA and writing style as well as referencing style. So if I quit sharing the slides with you, I can say all the best with your ongoing studies. Please don't forget that the library can offer lots of support. Do get in touch with us via email or the 24/7 chat, or come and see us in person now if you're comfortable doing that. And all the best with your future studies. Thank you.